If you're in the market for a new graphics card, the market is a bit wishy-washy at the moment, with cards from AMD and Nvidia being pretty lackluster at their respective price points. So what are you to do if you want to spend under $400 to get the very best gaming experience for your money? And that all important bang for buck. Well, you could always buy something used, like a 2080 Ti. Well, compared to the shiny new RTX 4060 Ti, it has more of the all-important VRAM, is cheaper, and is in theory the better product overall. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Now, I don't want to hark too much on about the state of the 4060 series in general, but the key takeaway is that for its $399 price tag, the 4060 Ti doesn't offer up enough over the previous generation, and in terms of value for money, didn't exactly set the world alight. A lot of this came down to consumers complaining about the 8 gig of VRAM, and with Nvidia seemingly trying to combat that with a 16 gig model for another $100 on top, things kind of went from bad to worse. Because while the VRAM clearly wasn't the big issue, it was more down to the interface and memory bandwidth, or lack thereof. So if memory is the big issue, surely a card from yesteryear with a higher capacity, increased bus, and oodles of bandwidth will potentially come out as the victor, right? Well, that's what we're going to find out today with the trusty old 2080 Ti, a card that launched way back in September of 2018 for a whopping $999. Now, while that makes it sound like we're comparing apples to oranges, as of late the 2080 Ti has dropped somewhat in price and can now be had, on average, for a little under $300. And that gives us something interesting to talk about, with just over $100 price difference between the 2080 Ti and the new RTX 4060 Ti. That means that the Turing-based GPU comes in on average 27% cheaper than the newest Ada Lovelace-based GPU. And for a card that used to be able to play games pretty well at higher resolutions like 4K, this head-to-head may not be as clear-cut as things first seem. So let's talk about specs. Firstly, the 2080 Ti comes in with 37% more memory, but as demonstrated by the 4060 Ti 16 gig, that's not the be-all and end-all. But things get more interesting when you look at the 175% increase in memory bus and 114% more memory bandwidth. Beyond that, the 2080 Ti comes in with the same amount of CUDA cores of 4,352, but beats the 4060 Ti in pretty much every other area, with 100% more texture mapping units, streaming multiprocessors, and RT cores, while also coming in with 83% more ROPS and 300% more Tensor cores, though of a different generation. The 4060 Ti does have more L1 cache per streaming multiprocessor, but as the 2080 Ti has more streaming multiprocessors, it still wins when looking at the total. Now, one area where the 4060 Ti does come out on top is in terms of L2 cache, with 482% more cache, which comes down to the new memory subsystem that's in place by Nvidia, which is why they believe having a cut down memory interface and less bandwidth isn't maybe as important as it once was. Now, I don't want to pretend that buying a 2080 Ti is an easy task, because it will involve buying one used, which I get it isn't for everyone due to warranties, the condition, the fact that it could have been mined on, and all that other stuff. Kind of that to one side, as it's a personal decision that you as a buyer will have to make, there's definitely an interesting matchup here and something that's worth testing. So to test, we put both cards onto our GPU benchmark system with an Intel Core i9-12900K on an Asus Maximus Z690 Hero motherboard, along with 32 gig of Patriot Viper 6200MHz dual channel DDR5 memory. All of our testing was performed on Windows 11, and we've tested a total of 15 games, with some also tested with ray tracing enabled to see how that stacks up as well. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So kicking things off with a Plague Tale Requiem on the Ultra preset, and things are already off to a rocky start, with the 2080 Ti sitting 9% faster than the newer Ada Lovelace GPU at 1080p, and a slightly larger 10% at 1440p. With us only on the first game, I'll reserve some judgment, but things, as I mentioned, are already off to a bit of a rocky start. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the 2080 Ti and 4060 Ti are pretty much identical in performance at 1080p, with the 4060 Ti edging it slightly by a margin of error of less than 1%, though it does come out with slightly better 6% performance in the lows, while at 1440p, the extra memory capabilities of the 2080 Ti show with 3% better performance compared to the 4060 Ti, a card that is, remember, 36% more expensive. There is some saving grace in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, where the 4060 Ti comes in with a lead of just under 13% at 1080p and a smaller 6% margin lead at 1440p. This all looks well and good until we remember the price disparity between the cards. 13% is nice, but for 36% more money in the first place, that's not much of a win in the grand scheme of things. Control is another game where memory really comes into play, with the 2080 Ti leading by 14% at 1080p and an even more impressive 19% at 1440p. This doesn't look good for the newest Ada Lovelace based GPU, considering the 2080 Ti launched nearly 5 years ago, and now, as mentioned, comes in dramatically cheaper, albeit for a used card. When we turn ray tracing on, it's a similar story, with the 2080 Ti coming in 12% faster at 1080p and a pretty impressive 18% at 1440p. If this is the start of things to come in terms of ray tracing performance, well, then the 4060 Ti doesn't look good at all. Cyberpunk is an extremely memory intensive game, and again, this shows with the 2080 Ti sitting 7% faster at 1080p and a larger 13% faster at 1440p. While the frame rates were perfectly playable on the 4060 Ti, even at the higher resolution, gives you an idea as to how the 4060 Ti is going to age with newer games coming out that will likely be even more memory intensive, showing that the capacity, interface and bandwidth are all leading to trouble. Luckily, when we enable ray tracing, the 4060 Ti proves its worth slightly, with a 7% lead over the 2080 Ti at 1080p, while at 1440p, the 2080 Ti pushes ahead by a single frame per second, which equates to a 4% margin. It's a lead at 1080p, but not enough to warrant the extra cost over the older Turing-based GPU. Death Stranding is another one that doesn't bode well for the newer 4060 Ti, with the older Turing-based GPU coming in 11% faster at 1080p and 13% faster at 1440p. Don't get me wrong, the frame rates are still very good, but in terms of value for money, considering the cost, the 4060 Ti falls very short in this game. Moving on to Doom Eternal, and the margins narrow quite a fair amount, now with the 4060 Ti coming out on top at 1080p, albeit by a margin of 3%, while 1440p sees that higher memory 2080 Ti take the lead, though only by a small margin of less than 1%. Again, while these numbers are a lot closer, the extra price premium for the 4060 Ti makes the proposition for buying it much worse. So really, the 2080 Ti has chalked up another win here. In Dying Light 2, things go from bad to worse again, with the 2080 Ti leading ahead by 9% at 1080p and 19% at 1440p. Considering the $399 price tag on the 4060 Ti, it's not looking great for Nvidia in some of the most demanding games that we test. Moving on to F122, and both cards come in with impressive numbers at both 1080p and 1440p, though the older 2080 Ti still manages to push ahead by 6% at 1080p and 4% at 1440p. Again, that memory buffer and bandwidth clearly plays a part, and while you wouldn't be disappointed with the performance of either card, based on the value for money, the 2080 Ti is by far the superior card. Next up is Far Cry 6, and again, both cards come in with some strong figures, though it's hard to ignore the extra 2% performance at 1080p and 10% extra at 1440p that the 2080 Ti gives us. If the cards were evenly matched in terms of price, the argument could be a bit stronger for the newest Nvidia-based GPU, but that's not the case, and so the 4060 Ti comes out even worse when talking about spending $400 on a GPU that gets beaten by a card from 2 generations before it, and for less money. In Hogwarts Legacy, we see some of our biggest differences, with the 2080 Ti packing an extra 20% more performance at 1080p and a pretty staggering 29% at 1440p. The higher resolution is clearly a factor in terms of memory, and that's why the 2080 Ti does so well here, with the 4060 Ti not even able to hit that magical 60 FPS threshold that most gamers crave. It's bad news for the 4060 Ti in Horizon Zero Dawn as well, with the 2080 Ti packing 6% more frames at 1080p and a larger 13% of 1440p. Again, considering the value aspect to the 4060 Ti, it's really hard to recommend buying it over something older, even if it does mean getting a warranty and knowing the history of the card, or in the case of buying new, the lack of history. Now, without sounding like I'm repeating myself, Spider-Man Remastered on the very high preset sees impressive results for both cards, and shows that the 2080 Ti is able to play the latest games, even on higher resolutions. It's here where the 4060 Ti trails behind by 4% at 1080p and an even greater 13% at 1440p. The 11GB of VRAM plus much wider bus and memory bandwidth is really making the 4060 Ti look pretty inferior overall. Enabling ray tracing doesn't help the 4060 Ti's case at all, where it only manages an extra margin of error 1 FPS more than the 2080 Ti at 1080p, and then falls behind by 6% at 1440p, showing that the older generation card isn't just better in rasterization, but is better in some of the latest technologies too. Microsoft Flight Sim is one of the most demanding games that we test in terms of GPU, CPU and memory, and it seems like the game is actually able to harness the newer architecture of the 4060 Ti, as it now leads by 13% against the 2080 Ti at 1080p, though it does fall behind by 4% at 1440p. Then finally in Watch Dogs Legion, we round things off with again a clear win to the 2080 Ti by 5% at 1080p and a slightly larger margin of 7% at 1440p. Though when looking at the FPS, the figures were very close, but that doesn't help the argument for the 4060 Ti being the more expensive card of the two and performing worse. Enabling ray tracing does allow the 4060 Ti to take the lead at 1080p by a small margin of 3%, though again the extra VRAM comes into play at 1440p and puts the 4060 Ti behind again by 5%. So I think it's pretty clear to see that the 2080 Ti annihilates the 4060 Ti, and in pretty much every game, even with ray tracing enabled. Now, even if the 4060 Ti did come out faster in certain titles like Assassin's Creed Valhalla at 1080p, Call of Duty at 1080 and 1440, and Doom Eternal at 1080p, the gains simply weren't enough to warrant the extra 36% more cash needed to actually buy the card. Now, when it comes to ray tracing performance, I was expecting good things from the newer GPU, but it just wasn't a match for the 2080 Ti with 100% more RT cores, even if they are of a different generation. Now, to get a better idea as to how each card did in all of the games tested, it's worth taking a look at the averages, where at 1080p, the 2080 Ti holds a modest 3% lead over the 4060 Ti, and then a slightly healthier 5% lead at 1440p. It's clear to see that the improved memory setup on the older card really does make a difference, and that the 2080 Ti has aged very well in comparison. Now, taking out the ray tracing results, because not everyone is sold on the technology, and we find the 2080 Ti managing to take a lead of 4% over the 4060 Ti, which may not sound like much, but when looking at pricing, a 4% lead for over $100 less cash is quite a stark difference. Now at 1440p, that lead did grow ever so slightly to 5% in favour again of the 2080 Ti, making an even stronger argument for keeping hold of that older GPU, or picking one up if you're in the market for a sub $400 GPU. So I think it's safe to say that the 4060 Ti wasn't looking great to start with, and by putting it up against the 2080 Ti has made it look even worse. A card from 5 years ago that now sells for cheaper and is able to hold the 4060 Ti and, more importantly, Nvidia to account. We're at, I guess, a tricky point when it comes to GPUs, as the generational uplift just isn't as good as what was expected by gamers and consumers. And that's clear as we know the 40 series in general isn't flying off the shelves at the same rate as we saw with the 30 series or even the 20 series. Now, when the 2080 Ti launched, there was such a big, I guess, buzz around it because it was so powerful in comparison to other offerings around the same time. And it's certainly aged extremely well with the ability to take on the 40 series and, well, as you saw, come out on top. Now, obviously, we are at the mercy of used GPU prices, and over the last couple of years, they have been, I guess, a bit hit and miss. But luckily, they have dropped in price. And that's what makes the likes of the 2080 Ti such a good investment, even now in 2023. And with the huge performance behind the memory subsystem, it should be good for a few more years to come. Whereas, the 4060 Ti lacks in that department. And while it struggles with certain titles of today, the 16GB card hasn't seemed to have made up for it either. While it's worrying now, you have to look ahead to the future and how badly it's potentially going to struggle then. Sure, the 2080 Ti fell short in some of the ray tracing tests and misses out on the likes of DLSS 3 with frame generation. But again, not everyone is sold on these technologies, and not all games can actually harness the potential of either of the features, especially if you're playing something competitive and fast paced. So I guess what I'm trying to say, depending on what games you play, this could be a deal breaker, and I'm not under any illusion of that not being the case. For now, if you are looking at buying a sub $400 GPU, I think there's still a few choices, with the likes of the 6700 XT from AMD that you can still get brand new for $329, or the likes of a used card like the 2080 Ti. Just kind of makes you wonder why anyone would entertain a 4060 Ti, 8 or 16 gig, a 4060 non-Ti, or even the AMD RX 7600, which does come in cheaper, but at what cost in terms of performance? They all just seem to be missing the mark. Looking at value for money, it's clear to see that the 2080 Ti offers superior value for money at just $2.55 per frame, which compared to the $3.67 per frame of the 4060 Ti, that means that the older Turing GPU comes in a staggering 30% cheaper per frame. Now, while that is, I guess, a key thing to look at, there are still other cards that, while they offer up less overall performance, they do offer better value for money, like the RTX 2070 at just $160. So maybe this is something we'll look at, comparing against the likes of the RX 7600 in a future piece of content, or even the RTX 4060 non-Ti, because average-wise, they are actually very, very close. And that about wraps up this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do and just can't get enough, then definitely check out our Patreon, where you'll get access to a whole host of cool goodies, including exclusive behind the scenes content, monthly live streams where we answer your questions, bi-weekly game nights that will leave you laughing for hours, and much, much more. The link, as always, is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.